Tom and Olivia didn't know what was forbidden. The hospital where they were receiving treatment felt like a fortress, everything under control. But at night, when everyone was asleep, something else drew them in. The dark cinema room with its covered windows. What started as a regular film soon turned into a nightmare they would never forget. But why did this film feel so terrifying? And what would they see when the screen began to watch them? When she reached the door, she hesitated again. It was almost too quiet. But then she pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The room was dim, with a few other patients already sitting in the dark, quietly watching a movie on the screen. The faint sound of the film was coming from the speakers, and Olivia felt a rush of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone. The room seemed inviting, a temporary escape from the hospital world she had been stuck in for so long. She slipped inside, quietly finding an empty seat in the back, hoping no one would notice her. As the movie started, Olivia let herself relax for the first time in days. The familiar feeling of being in a cinema, the soft hum of the screen, the dim lighting, it was enough to make her forget where she was for a while. She sank back into her seat, letting the movie wash over her, trying to forget the monotony of the hospital, even if only for a little while. Olivia quietly stepped out of her hospital room, her soft footsteps echoing in the dimly lit hallway. She had spent days in this sterile, silent environment, and the monotony was starting to get to her. The constant beeping of machines, the cold white walls, the silence, it all felt suffocating. She needed a distraction, something to break up the endless hours. Olivia had overheard some nurses talking about a small cinema room in the hospital where patients could watch movies. The idea of escaping her hospital room, even if just for a little while, sounded like exactly what she needed. Without hesitation, she made her way down the hallway, her heart quickening with the excitement of doing something a little rebellious. When she reached the door to the cinema room, she noticed it was slightly ajar. A soft glow from the screen flickered through the crack, and she could hear the faint sound of the movie playing inside. For a moment, Olivia hesitated. She wasn't sure if it was allowed to be there so late, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. She slowly pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the screen at the front. There were a few other patients scattered around, absorbed in the movie. Olivia slipped into an empty seat in the back row, hoping to remain unnoticed. As her eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, she realized the film was old. The grainy footage flickered and jumped as it played. The movements were jerky, and the actors' faces seemed strange, distorted. The quick cuts between the scenes left her feeling disoriented. The longer Olivia watched, the more uncomfortable she became. The actors' faces twisted unnaturally, their expressions strange and hard to understand. The sound was odd, too, a faint, unsettling hum, as though it didn't belong. The whole thing felt off, as if the film was trying to pull her into its distorted world. Then something happened that made Olivia's heart race. One of the actors, a man with a grotesquely twisted face, suddenly turned his gaze toward the camera. His eyes locked onto Olivia's, unblinking. It felt like he was staring directly at her, and for a moment she froze, her pulse quickening. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. His gaze was intense, unnerving. She glanced at Tom, who had followed her into the room. He was still watching the screen, his expression blank. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest. The images on the screen were becoming more chaotic, the faces more distorted. She could feel the air in the room grow colder, the noise from the film growing louder, more intense. The longer she sat there, the more trapped she felt. The strange film seemed to pull her in, suffocating her with its distorted images and unnerving sound. She glanced around at the other patients, but no one else seemed to notice what was happening. It felt like she and Tom were the only ones affected by the film, as if it had some strange hold over them. Olivia sat on her hospital bed, her legs dangling over the side, staring at her younger brother, Tom, who was sitting in the corner of the room, his eyes glued to the screen of his phone. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, absorbed in the game he was playing, not even noticing her. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the hospital air conditioning. The sterile white walls and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall made the space feel even more lifeless. Olivia shifted uncomfortably, her eyes moving from Tom to the window, where the dull city lights outside cast a faint glow. She sighed, feeling the weight of the endless hours spent in the hospital, the silence stretching on with no one to talk to. Fear began to creep up on Olivia. The scenes on the screen were too disturbing, too intense. The faces twisted, their mouths moving in unnatural ways. The noise in the room felt suffocating. She had to leave. She grabbed Tom's arm, pulling him up from his seat. They had to get out. As they stood and made their way toward the door, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that the film was still watching them, its images flickering in her mind. She didn't look back. She didn't want to. All she wanted was to escape the room, escape the feeling of being trapped in something she couldn't understand. Tom and Olivia sat in the dark cinema room, the flickering images on the screen casting an eerie glow on their faces. At first, the film seemed strange but harmless. However, the longer they watched, the more unsettling it became. The actors' movements were jerky and unnatural, their expressions distorted as if something was wrong. Olivia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling an increasing sense of unease. The scenes were disjointed, jumping erratically from one into the next, making it hard to follow what was happening. The sound in the room grew louder, more distorted. At first it was just background noise, but now it was becoming overwhelming. Sharp, unnatural, and jarring. The voices of the actors seemed warped, like they were coming from somewhere deep underground. It didn't feel like just a film anymore. It felt like something else, something that was deliberately trying to unsettle her. Olivia's heart raced as she looked at Tom. He was still fixated on the screen, oblivious to the growing tension. Olivia tried to focus on the film, but the more she watched, the more the discomfort spread. The faces on the screen twisted unnaturally, their eyes too wide, their mouths stretched in bizarre ways. She could feel the room growing colder, the air heavier. Then one of the actors turned his face toward the camera, his eyes locking with Olivia's. His gaze was unblinking, direct, and chilling. For a moment, it felt as if he could see her, sitting there in the dark, watching him. Olivia's heart skipped a beat, and she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She couldn't look away, even though every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. Tom, still unaware of the tension building in the room, remained engrossed in the film. Olivia's pulse quickened. She grabbed Tom's arm, her fingers tightening around him, trying to pull him away. The film felt alive, like it was aware of their presence, watching them. The more she tried to ignore it, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. She leaned closer to Tom, her voice trembling as she spoke. She could barely bring herself to say it, but she had to. "Tom, I can't watch this. Something's wrong." Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she could feel the fear taking hold of her. The movie had crossed a line, and she could no longer stay in the room, in that place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare seemed to blur. Tom glanced at her, confused by her sudden distress. But Olivia couldn't stay. The film was no longer just a strange old movie. It had become something darker, something that had wrapped itself around her, pulling her deeper into its grip. Olivia stood up, her legs shaky beneath her, and tugged at Tom's arm again. "We need to leave now," she whispered urgently, her voice laced with fear. But Tom hesitated, his eyes still glued to the screen. Olivia couldn't explain what she was feeling, but she knew they had to get out. The film had already taken too much from her, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stay before it swallowed them whole. She had been in this room for what felt like days, and nothing seemed to change. Tom, always immersed in his games and his phone, barely acknowledged her presence. Olivia had tried to make the best of it, reading books or looking out the window, but everything felt monotonous and empty. The days blurred together, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in this sterile environment. The sound of the clock ticking seemed louder now, as the minutes stretched into hours, each one more unbearable than the last. Tom and Olivia finally stood up, their chairs creaking as they hurriedly moved toward the exit. They had to leave. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface had now overwhelmed them. But as they started to make their way toward the door, the screen suddenly brightened, flooding the room with a harsh, blinding light. The rapid flicker of the scenes had already unsettled them, but now the images were becoming even more distorted. The faces on the screen twisted further, the features stretching unnaturally. It was as though the film itself was warping, changing to something they couldn't understand. Olivia's breath quickened. She grabbed Tom's arm, her fingers tight with panic. They had to get out, but no matter how fast they moved, the screen seemed to follow them. The faces, those grotesque, warped faces, shifted in and out of focus, their eyes still locked onto the two of them. Olivia's pulse raced as she realized something was horribly wrong. It wasn't just a bad film. This was something far worse. It felt alive, as though the screen had a will of its own. The eyes of the actors didn't just stare. They seemed to watch them, track their every movement, and for a moment, it was as if the faces on the screen had stopped shifting and were frozen, staring directly at them. The room was too silent now, the sharp sound of static and disjointed whispers growing louder, more oppressive. Olivia could barely breathe, the weight of the atmosphere pressing on her chest. She tried to reach for the door handle, but her hands were trembling too much to grip it. The film continued, relentless in its chaos. The once flickering, distorted faces now appeared in extreme close-up, their features growing larger, clearer, more detailed with every passing second. It was as if the film was magnifying them, zooming in to make them impossible to ignore. Tom's eyes were wide with terror now. The calmness he had tried to maintain earlier had evaporated, replaced with the same fear that Olivia felt. He turned to her, pulling at her sleeve, trying to get her to move faster. But the door seemed so far away. The light from the screen grew blinding, and the noise from the speakers intensified, each sound grating against their senses. The faces on the screen continued to distort. The eyes seemed to glow, unnatural in their intensity. And then, as if to make the horror complete, one of the faces, an actor with a twisted grin, appeared to lunge toward them, his image stretching beyond the confines of the screen, as if it were reaching out to them. Olivia's heart skipped a beat, and she screamed. The film wasn't just watching them, it was trying to pull them in. In a panic, they both sprinted toward the door. But the closer they got, the more the room seemed to close in on them. The walls felt like they were tightening, the light from the screen growing so bright it burned their retinas. It felt like they were trapped in the room with the film itself, as if it had become part of the very space they occupied. Every step they took toward the exit was met with resistance, as though the very air around them had thickened, making each movement harder to make. The moment they reached the door, Olivia grabbed the handle with trembling hands and yanked it open, but the noise from the film followed them, lingering in the air like a haunting echo. They didn't look back, their legs moving faster as they rushed into the hallway, away from the screen. They ran down the corridor away from the twisted images that had haunted them. But the feeling of dread didn't leave them. They knew that whatever had happened in that room was far from over. The morning light filtered into the hospital room, casting long shadows across the sterile space. Olivia sat on the bed, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, while Tom sat beside her, staring at the floor. The silence between them felt heavy, the events of the previous night still fresh in their minds. Neither of them had spoken since fleeing the cinema room. Olivia glanced at Tom, his face pale and tired, and knew he felt the same unease. She couldn't keep it inside any longer. She had to tell their parents what had happened. She stood up, walking to the door and stepping into the hallway. Tom followed her silently. They walked together, their footsteps echoing in the quiet, empty halls of the hospital. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she made her way to their parents' room. Olivia glanced at the clock again. 12 a.m. She couldn't sleep. She had tried, but the bed was uncomfortable, and the constant noise from the hospital kept her awake. Tom, on the other hand, was perfectly content, lost in his virtual world. Olivia knew he wouldn't care if she asked him to do something with her. He was too focused on his game. She tried calling out to him once more, but he didn't even look up. When they arrived, Olivia knocked softly. Her mother opened the door, smiling but her concern obvious. Their father, sitting nearby, looked up from his newspaper. Olivia sat at the edge of the bed, her voice shaking as she spoke. She was afraid to say it, but she knew she had to. "Mom, Dad, we watched a movie in the hospital cinema last night. It was awful. There was something wrong with it. The faces on the screen, they weren't right, and the noise, it felt like something was watching us." Her parents exchanged worried glances, and her mother placed a hand on Olivia's, reassuring her. "I'm glad you told us," she said softly. "You did the right thing." Olivia nodded, her hands twisting in together. Her father leaned forward, his expression serious. "What you saw wasn't safe. Movies like that can affect how you see things. We'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Olivia felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Her parents were taking her fears seriously, and they would make sure nothing like that would happen again. Tom, sitting quietly next to her, looked relieved. As they talked about the steps they'd take to address the issue, Olivia's fear slowly faded. She still felt unsettled, but knowing her parents were taking action gave her a sense of safety. She had spoken up, and now things would be okay. The hospital room was quiet, the soft hum of machines the only sound breaking the silence. Olivia and Tom sat together on the bed, reflecting on the events of the past few days. The tension that had once filled the room had faded, leaving a sense of calm behind. The fear from the film, the strange and unsettling images, felt distant now, though still fresh in their minds. The weight that had pressed on their chests had finally lifted. Olivia glanced at Tom, noticing the change in him. He seemed quieter, more thoughtful than usual. The anxiety and uncertainty that had clouded his eyes when they'd watched the film were gone, replaced by a deeper understanding. Olivia realized that though the experience had been frightening, it had brought them closer. She had learned to trust her instincts, to speak up when something felt wrong, and most importantly, she had learned that her family would always be there to listen and protect her. Tom, too, had learned a valuable lesson. He hadn't understood the depth of Olivia's fear at first, but now he recognized how the film had affected her. His earlier detachment had been replaced by genuine concern. He regretted not noticing sooner how disturbed she had been, and the bond between them had strengthened as a result. Their parents had acted quickly, ensuring that nothing like the terrifying film would happen again. They'd installed filters on all the hospital screens to prevent harmful content from reaching the patients. Olivia felt a sense of security return, knowing that their safety was being prioritized. As the evening wore on, Olivia and Tom exchanged a quiet smile. Despite the fear and confusion, they now understood the importance of trust, communication, and protecting each other. The experience had been unsettling, but it had reinforced their connection as siblings and their reliance on their parents' support. Sighing again, she stood up from the bed and walked over to the window, gazing out at the city below. The streets were empty, the lights flickering like tiny stars against the dark sky. It was so quiet. She longed for something different, something to break the routine of hospital life. She thought about her parents, who had been visiting her every day, but even their presence had started to feel distant as they were always busy with their own concerns. Olivia leaned back against the pillows, feeling the weight of the ordeal slip away. She was grateful for the love and security of her family. With them by her side, she knew she could face anything that came their way. Her mind wandered back to a conversation she overheard earlier in the week. Some of the nurses had mentioned a small cinema room on the lower floor of the hospital. They played movies for the patients, a welcome distraction from the endless hospital routine. Olivia had heard other kids talk about it, but she hadn't dared to check it out herself. She wasn't sure if it was allowed, but the idea of going to see a movie in the middle of the night, away from the sterile confines of her room, was tempting. She could at least get some peace, even if only for a short time. Olivia stood for a moment, uncertain. She wasn't supposed to leave her room without permission, but the idea of sneaking into the cinema room felt like a small act of rebellion that might offer her the break she desperately needed. She looked over at Tom again, still fixated on his phone, and made up her mind. Quietly, she opened the door to her room, slipping out into the hallway. The corridor was dimly lit, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above the only sound. Olivia glanced back at her room, making sure Tom hadn't noticed her slip out. She tiptoed down the hall, her sneakers making no sound on the polished floor. She wasn't sure if the cinema was still open, but she figured it was worth a try. The soft glow of the exit signs led her towards the elevator, which was just around the corner.